At 13:30 hours on November 23, 1943, Colonel David Shoup stood on a strip of coral barely 2 miles long, watching Navy Seabees already measuring and marking the airfield they would soon rebuild. The fighting had barely ended. Smoke still drifted from shattered bunkers. The smell of burned cordite and coral dust hung in the air. Yet the war had already moved on. 76 hours earlier, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had promised Tokyo that Betio could not fall in 100 years. Now it had fallen in 3 days. Shibazaki's confidence had not been careless bravado. When the Japanese seized Tarawa in 1942, they immediately recognized its value. The atoll sat astride America's Central Pacific route, a stepping stone that controlled access to the Marshall Islands and beyond. From the moment the island was occupied, construction began. Korean laborers and Japanese engineers cut coral blocks from the lagoon floor, mixing concrete with crushed coconut shells to build defenses unlike anything the Americans had faced before. Over 14 months, Betio became a fortress compressed into just 118 hectares of sand, never more than 10 feet above sea level, surrounded by a reef that turned the lagoon into a killing ground. By the time Shibazaki arrived in July 1943, the island already bristled with weapons, but he demanded more. For massive 8-inch coastal guns were placed in concrete turrets at each end of the island, their barrels capable of hurling 256-pound shells 16 miles across the ocean. 40 field pieces and howitzers were positioned to cover every approach. More than 500 pillboxes were constructed from coral, coconut logs, and reinforced concrete, each one interlocked with the others so that no attacker could advance without crossing overlapping fields of fire. Trenches and tunnels honeycombed the island, allowing defenders to move unseen from one position to another. Some bunkers had roofs 5 feet thick, layered specifically to survive direct hits from battleship guns. Shibazaki walked the island daily, studying how the reef forced attackers to cross hundreds of yards of open water. When Japanese reporters visited in October, he spoke confidently. 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. Across the Pacific, American planners were staking everything on a different equation. Operation Galvanic called for the 2nd Marine Division to seize Betio in 76 hours and turn its airstrip into a bomber base. The plan relied on technology that had never been tested in battle. Amphibious tractors, LVTs, would crawl across the reef and deliver Marines directly to the seawall, bypassing the obstacle that had defeated landing craft for decades. On paper, it solved the problem. In reality, everything depended on the tide. Colonel David Shoup, a methodical planner known for distrusting optimism, studied aerial photographs in the wardroom of his command ship. The island looked impossibly small, packed with guns, bunkers, and trenches. What troubled him most were the tide tables. Navy hydrographers predicted enough water for Higgins boats to cross the reef later in the assault. Local pilots warned otherwise. Seasonal conditions could leave the reef nearly dry. If that happened, Marines would have to wade 600 yards under fire, weighed down by 60 pounds of gear. Shoup raised the concern, but the plan was already locked. 35,000 American troops were committed. 7 battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers assembled offshore. The timetable was precise. Bombardment at dawn. Airstrikes. Landings at 0900. On the night of November 19th, transport ships anchored in darkness. Marines climbed down cargo nets into waiting LVTs as the marine hymn echoed across the lagoon. But even before the first shot was fired, the plan began to fracture. Battleships anchored in the wrong positions. Carrier strikes slipped behind schedule. Communication gaps went unnoticed. At dawn, the tide gauges read barely 2.5 feet over the reef. At 0545, the bombardment began. 16-inch shells from USS Maryland slammed into Betio, erupting coral and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. 7 battleships fired in sequence, joined by cruisers and destroyers closing to near point-blank range. Carrier planes dove through smoke and flak, dropping bombs on suspected bunkers. From his command bunker, Shibazaki watched calmly. His coastal guns answered, straddling American battleships with towering columns of water. For 20 minutes, the duel raged, until American firepower overwhelmed the exposed guns. By mid-morning, 3 of the 4 8-inch batteries were silent. But the Real defense lay deeper. Hundreds of machine guns, mortars, and field pieces survived untouched. When the first wave of LVTs crossed the reef at 0900, Japanese gunners waited until the tractors were well within range. Then the lagoon erupted. Heavy machine gun rounds punched through thin armor. Mortars walked shells into the formations. LVTs burned and stalled in shallow water. Marines leapt into chest-deep surf under fire. Behind them, Higgins boats grounded on coral 600 yards from shore. Marines poured over the sides and began the long wade forward. Officers fell almost immediately. Units disintegrated into small groups struggling from coral head to coral head, while machine guns swept predictable channels. The water turned red. Men drowned under the weight of their packs. Some companies lost nearly half their strength before reaching the seawall. Those who reached the beach found little shelter. The seawall, built of coconut logs and coral, became the only cover. Japanese fire raked the sand from pillboxes just yards away. Radios failed. Commanders were dead or missing. The assault teetered on the edge of collapse. Shoup reached shore and established a command post in a shattered bunker near the pier. With communications gone, he used runners and fragments of information to rebuild control. He called naval gunfire to within 100 yards of Marine positions. Destroyers fired directly into trench lines. Airstrikes were redirected onto targets marked by smoke. As the tide finally rose, more LVTs crossed the reef bringing ammunition, evacuating wounded, and landing tanks. Sherman tanks that survived the reef immediately shifted the balance. Their 75mm guns smashed pillboxes at point-blank range. By sunset, a thin foothold held behind the seawall. The Japanese fire slackened. Unknown to the Marines, a naval shell had already killed Shibazaki that afternoon, severing the command structure that held the defense together. Without centralized control, Japanese resistance fractured. Night brought desperate infiltration attacks fought at knife range in trenches and tunnels. At dawn, Japanese light tanks attempted an unsupported charge and were destroyed by bazookas and pack artillery. Marines began to understand the fortress's fatal flaw. The bunkers faced the sea. From behind, they were blind. New tactics spread rapidly. One team pinned defenders while another flanked from the rear with satchel charges and flamethrowers. Pillboxes that had resisted hours of bombardment fell in minutes. Progress was slow, brutal, and costly, but relentless. By the afternoon of November 21st, Marines crossed the airfield and cut the island in half. On November 22nd, a surprise landing on the ocean side shattered the remaining defense. Attacked from an unexpected direction, Japanese positions collapsed one by one. Flamethrowers turned concrete shelters into furnaces. Satchel charges sealed exits. A final banzai attack was annihilated by machine gun and mortar fire. By dawn on November 23rd, organized resistance ended. Engineers counted bodies packed into bunkers where men had chosen death over surrender. At 13:30, Shoup confirmed Betio was secure. The island that was supposed to hold for a century had fallen in 76 hours. The cost shocked America. Over 1,000 Marines and hundreds of sailors died on an island smaller than many city parks. Photographs of bodies floating in the lagoon stunned the public. Yet the lessons of Tarawa reshaped the war. Future assaults used longer bombardments, more amphibious vehicles, better intelligence, and refined tactics. The airfield was operational within weeks, launching bombers deeper into Japanese territory. Tarawa proved that no fortress is impregnable, only outdated. Static defenses could not adapt. Marines learned faster than defenders could respond. And on a narrow strip of coral called Betio, the mathematics of war were rewritten in blood, smoke, and 76 brutal hours that changed amphibious warfare forever.